During previous episodes detailing alleged cryptid encounters, we have explored the origins of the entities involved, with many of such cases attributed to historic instances of witchcraft and the arcane. There are, however, other theories for the genesis of these creatures. Join us as we relate a horrifying account from Ohio, leaving us to question what happened in the steel mill. Thanks to BetterHelp for being this video's paid partner. BetterHelp is an online service that connects you to a credentialed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. Most people don't know this about me, but I've actually struggled with anxiety for most of my life. Those of you who suffer with this debilitating condition know how exhausting it can be to worry all the time, struggle with falling asleep at night, and be on edge. Lately, I've been using therapy to improve my mental health. I'm learning ways to calm myself when my anxiety starts to spike. Over 4 million people have used BetterHelp to start living a healthier, happier life. So if that's something you want, visit betterhelp.com/bedtimestories. I really like that BetterHelp makes it possible to connect with therapists outside my area that I might not be able to meet in person. First, you fill out a short questionnaire, then you're matched with a BetterHelp therapist who can contact you multiple ways, by phone, video chat, or messaging you at a time that works for you. If that first therapist isn't a great fit, you can switch at no extra charge. It's a new year and a great time to try therapy on your own terms. Go to betterhelp.com/bedtimestories for 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp and get matched with a therapist who will listen and help. Cases of lycanthropy date back as far as ancient Greece, and can be found in the writings of cultures from all over the world. Werewolf attacks feature heavily in the sagas of Scandinavian folklore and arise repeatedly within the writings of medieval chroniclers. Such tales extend across the globe, arriving on the shores of the New World at the same time the European colonists set foot upon the North American continent. In nearly all of these cases, the concept of lycanthropy has been treated as a form of supernatural punishment, with the original victim having fallen prey to a magical hex or spell, in turn passing their curse onto the survivors of their attacks. Similar stories of magical misadventure and its weaponization are to be found in the history of America's indigenous populations. Hapless individuals could be transformed into savage and monstrous beasts, either as a result of their own ambitions or the malicious intentions of another. However, descriptions of the classic European werewolf differ in many ways to what has come to be known as the North American Dogman. On the one hand, some say that the narrative of lycanthropy as a purely magical concept has begun to transform. On the other, it could be argued that both of these creatures have different origins entirely. Either way, there is no shortage of eyewitness accounts pertaining to the reality of such beasts, and one of the most terrifying examples of these encounters occurred in the US state of Ohio during the 1980s. A small group of teenagers would have an unexpected run-in with a horrifying entity which would change their lives forever. Throughout the late 1980s, Matthew Emch and his peers spent their teenage years exploring the remote and secluded areas near their homes in Youngstown, Ohio. Chief amongst these locations was a sprawling industrial site that had once been a thriving steel mill, situated in close proximity to the home of one of Matthew's best friends. On multiple occasions, the group of 4 boys would cross the street from the home in question cutting through the insecure fencing and making their way deep into the complex. It had been during these explorations that they had discovered their favourite part of the abandoned facility, located near to where the blast furnace had once sat. It was a 4-story building long since broken and degraded, where the quartet could hang out and stay largely away from any trouble. Using thick steel sheets which had been discarded, the boys were able to shield themselves from any other trespassers on site. They would usually spend their evenings burning pallets in the middle of the building's first floor, gazing out at the crumbling and broken walls at the dilapidated site around them. During the months they paid visits to this place, it was rare that they found evidence of any other persons having accessed the site. The only other trespassers which they ever encountered were the numerous packs of wild dogs that roamed the deserted access roads and alleyways. It was rumoured that these volatile creatures had been responsible for the deaths of 2 homeless men, whose bodies had been recovered from the site. There was also speculation that the remains of others had been found by the authorities, their bodies deposited there following incidents involving the mafia and other local gangs. But one night in mid-June of 1987, a horrifying event would transpire, which would bring the tranquil routine the boys had adopted to a brutal end. The evening had begun like any other they had spent at the location, with the boys assembled around a large fire, talking amongst themselves and eating various snacks. After a while they had settled into a more reflective mood as they sat quietly gazing at the buildings around them. However, this relative silence was unexpectedly shattered by the sound of barking dogs as a pack of these animals shot into view, running at speed along the path immediately outside the building. They then turned sharply to the left, running up the slopes of one of the towering coke deposits, which stretched for hundreds of meters in either direction and disappeared over the crest. Moments later, the barking suddenly escalated into a series of deafening howls and yelps, with the 4 onlookers assuming that the animals were now fighting with one another or another pack of wild dogs. That was until one of the canines was suddenly pitched up and over the coke pile, roughly 15 feet in the air, before landing in a broken heap on the slope facing them. In a heartbeat, another dog was then hurled up and over the coke pile, with the second animal having sustained a deep and bloody gash to the side of its body, barely able to limp clear of the carnage. The boys watched in growing confusion as what remained of the pack came hurtling back over the pile, fleeing for their lives from whatever was on the other side. They ran at full tilt back in the direction they had come from, whimpering and yelping as they went. Matt and 2 of his friends followed their progress before they heard the 4th of their number say, "Guys, what is that?" As they turned back to look at the coke pile, they watched as a hulking, dark shape emerged from beyond the crest, about 25 feet from their position. The creature was unlike anything any of them had ever seen before, either in real life or their wildest imaginations. Standing on all fours, silently surveying the retreating pack of dogs, it was bigger and more muscular than any large bear, but far closer in profile to that of a dog or wolf. Matt would later recount that it was so big that it looked almost fake. As he stared down at this monstrous interloper, feeling much like he was caught in a dream, it cocked its leg and began to urinate onto the coke pile, the force with which it did so causing debris to fly up wherever the stream hit. Alarmed, one of the other boys inadvertently backed into some of the metal sheeting they had used to build their den. The heavy steel grated as it travelled across the dusty rubble beneath, emitting a sharp metallic rattle which echoed into the night. Immediately, the head of the creature snapped in their direction. It stared at them for a moment, its features morphing from confusion into something far more menacing in nature. Matthew found his attention instantaneously drawn directly to its eyes, which were emitting a deep and beguiling amber glow. This was not eyeshine. Rather, it seemed as if they were backlit by some internal power source. It looked at each of the 4 boys in turn, before finally settling on Matt, who would later describe feeling as if the creature was somehow looking right into his soul. Before he or any of his friends could move, the beast before them suddenly rose up onto its hind legs, revealing a height twice that of an average person. Its upper limbs were so long that they reached down almost to its ankles, terminating in a wicked-looking set of sharp claws, although its paws looked much more like a raccoon's. It was at this point that the creature then emitted a long and throaty growl, which travelled up and across the short distance to where they were standing. This immediately washed over and enveloped them, filling them with an intense sense of dread and resulting in a state of near paralysis. The creature then moved at speed down from the top of the coke pile onto the path below, sprinting across to the building where the boys were sheltering. Shaking off his stupor, Matt quickly began to marshal his terrified friends, urging them to hurry up to the 3rd floor. In the centre of the building was a wide open shaft, which allowed anyone on the top floor to see down to the bottom floor and vice versa. The drop was protected on all sides by a 4-foot concrete wall, which the group concealed themselves behind as they peered down to where their fire was still burning on the 1st floor. In order to enter the building, it was necessary to climb up over a gap in the lower staircase, where 4 or 5 of the steps had long since fallen away. But whilst this obstruction had prevented any of the stray dog packs from entering, the sound of deep footfalls soon revealed it had proven no obstacle to the creature. An impossibly long shadow soon gave way to a sleek and dark shape that slowly made its way past the blazing fire. The light revealed it to be completely covered in a pelt of inch-long black fur, other than a slightly paler strip of hair that ran down the length of its spine. From their hiding places, the boys watched on as the muscles in the creature's shoulders worked back and forth, and a thick stream of saliva poured from its jaws. Its head turned this way and that as it sniffed the air, before its gaze settled on the stairs that led to the upper floors. In that moment, Matt could barely suppress a gasp of astonishment. In the light of the fire, he saw its front left paw momentarily disappear, phasing and rippling out of existence as if it had temporarily become cloaked or simply failed to manifest itself. For the 2nd time that evening, its head suddenly snapped in their direction. As it gazed up at them, it let out another growl, but this time it had less of an effect as they were partly shielded by the concrete wall. Moving swiftly with its tail acting as a kind of rudder, the creature then vaulted the stairs, arriving at the 2nd floor. At that moment, seeing how quick and powerful its movements were, Matt realised that there was no way he and his friends would survive this encounter. It effortlessly leapt up the last set of stairs to the 3rd floor, and that's when it finally came face to face with the 4 youngsters. As it stood there regarding them from the top of the staircase no more than 15 feet away, it bared its teeth and took a step towards them. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a tremendous roar followed by a piercing shriek from outside, as a train thundered through the complex and blasted its horn. For a few precious seconds, its head shot back and forth between the boys and the passing train as if unsure how to proceed, until a second horn blast caused it to turn and run back down the stairs. Matt followed its progress, watching as the creature reached the last set of steps before exiting the building. The fleeing figure's body seemed to somehow lose all definition as it passed the threshold there, transforming into a shapeless black shadow as it disappeared from view. One of his friends immediately descended into utter panic, screaming and shouting for help as Matt and the others tried desperately to silence him. They would spend the next half an hour convincing the boy that to remain in the building would only increase the possibility of the creature returning, and that to run for home was the only alternative. Dragging their sobbing friend along with them, the three other boys hurried through the abandoned complex, stopping in terror at any slight sound or movement around them. They would eventually leave the site, and resolved not to speak of the incident until they had assembled all of their parents together, a conversation which took place several days later. Matt's mother had immediately been dismissive of the tale, accusing the youths of telling lies and warning them not to visit the site ever again. His father, however, had been more understanding. He felt that the four boys had genuinely believed what they had seen, and suggested that Matthew visit the local priest for guidance. To his surprise, the clergyman had listened patiently to the story before telling the boy that what he had encountered was likely a very real and highly dangerous manifestation. He went on to explain that there were evil forces that occasionally managed to make their way into our world, and that he and his friends had been lucky to escape. It was at this time that Matt came to believe it was an act of God that had saved his life and those of his friends, with their desperate prayers having been answered. The passing train driver had caught sight of their fire through the open walls of the building, sounding the train's horn in an effort to drive them off site, saving their lives in the process. Days later, upon speaking to one of the other boys whose father was a local police officer, Matt was stunned by what his friend had been told. The authorities had been aware that some sort of creature was frequenting the site, with the police having responded to a number of similar reports in the past. He was also told in no uncertain terms that if the boys ever trespassed there again, any opportunities of further education or a future sporting career would be denied. This led Matt and his friends to consider whether the bodies which had previously been discovered there had in fact been killed by roaming canines or something far more demonic. If they had not been saved by the passing train, what would have become of them? And would they have been listed simply as the victims of yet another wild dog attack? The trauma of that night's events would go on to deeply affect all of them, resulting in the need for counselling. It would also tragically lead to the premature deaths of two of Matt's friends. As he grew older, he resolved to uncover answers to the uncomfortable questions generated by this sinister incident. He took the time to research other alleged cryptid encounters, before becoming emboldened enough to reach out to those involved in similar events. Of particular interest to him were accounts involving cryptids which apparently fade in or out of existence, or seem to be able to cloak themselves in the presence of witnesses. This has led him to favour theories in which such creatures enter and depart our existence via portals, connecting wherever they reside to our own world, be they a form of spiritual or demonic entity, or the inhabitants of some neighbouring reality or dimension. This was a somewhat condensed version of Matt's story, which he related in an interview on the YouTube channel What Lurks Beneath. Although we have tried to include as much detail as possible, there are many nuances in Matt's personal retelling which we just couldn't replicate here, and for this reason, it's well worth listening to his own account. This experience would prove so traumatic to Matt and those with him that in later life he would devote a great deal of his time to researching and investigating cryptids of all shapes and sizes, and would eventually set up his own YouTube channel, Planet 412, which we will link in the description for anyone who wishes to check it out. While some may find this story far-fetched, he comes across as a genuine and compelling witness, and we're of the opinion that he and his friends undoubtedly saw something on that June evening back in 1987. What they saw might well be up for debate, but it was horrifying enough to change the course of all their lives. He is not the first and will most certainly not be the last person to report seeing these terrifying entities. There are many strange things happening in the world of late. Things which people have compared to the horrors related in the Book of Revelation, with many believing that the end times are upon us. Whilst this is not a religious channel, and we cannot attest to the veracity of drawing such parallels, the last book of the Bible does mention the many horrifying creatures that would be unleashed upon mankind in the final days. Could this be why sightings of these creatures not only show no signs of abating, but seem to be on the increase? Who really knows for sure? In January of 1931, the inhabitants of an entire village situated on the shores of Lake Anjakuni disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The Mounties who were dispatched to investigate knew nothing of the matter, other than a telegram received from the settlement some weeks prior, which spoke of blue lights and strange aircraft witnessed in the skies overhead. Also, during the 1970s, Chicago's northern districts were rocked by the brutal slaying of a local hospital therapist. The murder would eventually be solved by Chicago PD after a series of eerie events in which it appeared that the spirit of the deceased was attempting to guide the police in their investigations. Join us on the podcast in February for a timed exclusive episode relating two brand new stories: The Village That Vanished and A Voice from Beyond the Grave.